I supported my sister in everything, but she silently envied me, manipulated our parents and therapists to my marriage. And then growing up in the sleepy town of Riverton, nestled along the banks of the Magnolia River, life was pretty idyllic at first. Riverton wasn't big, barely 15,000 people, but it had a certain charm. The winding streets were lined with old brick buildings, a main street dotted with mom-and-pop shops, and the comforting hum of small-town life. For the longest time, it felt like nothing could go wrong here. I shared a simple, peaceful life with my older sister, Emily. Emily wasn't just my sister. She was my everything. We were inseparable. I always looked up to her, not only because she was older by 4 years, but because she had this innate wisdom and patience. Emily was the type of person who radiated kindness, like someone who had seen the world and all its struggles, but chose to smile anyway. Our parents, Rachel and Tom, were hard workers. Both of them held down demanding jobs, Dad as a construction site manager and Mom as a nurse in the emergency room at Riverton General. Their shifts were long and grueling, so it often felt like Emily and I were left to our own devices. When I was little, that didn't bother me at all. In fact, I loved it because it meant I had Emily all to myself. She was the one who got me up in the mornings, who packed my lunch, who helped me with my homework when I couldn't understand the math problems that made me want to scream. Emily made it all better. She never got frustrated when I asked the same question 3 or 4 times. Instead, she'd patiently explain things, her soft voice turning the complicated into something I could grasp. We'd spend hours together, studying, talking, just being around each other. But even then, I realize now, there were signs that things weren't perfect. Emily's smile didn't always reach her eyes. She had this way of zoning out when she thought no one was looking, staring into the distance with a heaviness in her eyes that seemed too deep for a 16-year-old. I was too young to understand it back then, and perhaps too selfish. Emily was my rock, my constant, so it never occurred to me that she might be struggling under the weight of something far bigger than I could see. When high school hit, things started to change in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. Emily was still there for me, always helping with homework and protecting me from whatever minor social disasters middle school could throw at me. But she was changing. There were moments when she seemed far away, even though she was right next to me. I remember one day in particular. It must have been a week before my 12th birthday. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a math book open in front of me, struggling as usual. Emily was sitting opposite me, but instead of her usual encouraging explanations, she was tapping her pen on the table, eyes darting back and forth as if she was having a conversation in her head. When I asked her to help me, she snapped, "Figure it out yourself, can't you?" before catching herself and immediately apologizing. That was the first time I'd ever seen her like that, but I brushed it off as a bad day. We all have bad days, right? What I didn't know at the time was that Emily was fighting demons I had no way of understanding. Our parents weren't around enough to notice, and even if they had been, I'm not sure they would have seen it either. Emily was good at hiding her pain. By the time Emily turned 17, she had started getting into trouble. Little things at first: skipping classes, staying out past curfew, talking back to our parents in ways she never had before. Mom and Dad chalked it up to teenage rebellion, a phase she'd grow out of. But it wasn't just a phase. Emily was spiraling, and none of us noticed in time. I started seeing cuts on her arms. At first, I didn't understand what they were. I thought maybe she'd scraped herself at work or during one of her frequent late-night walks around Riverton. But when the cuts became more frequent and she started wearing long sleeves even in the middle of July, I realized something wasn't right. I tried to ask her about it once, but she brushed me off with a quick, "Don't worry about it, Maddie. I'm fine." The look in her eyes said otherwise. Things escalated from there. She started dating this guy, Ryan, who everyone in town knew was trouble. He was older, had a reputation for dealing drugs, and had already been arrested a couple of times. Emily fell for him hard, and the more involved she got with Ryan, the more she seemed to drift away from us. Mom and Dad tried to intervene, but it was like Emily was slipping through their fingers. She fought with them constantly, slamming doors, screaming that they didn't understand her. There were nights when I'd lie in bed and hear her crying in the room next to mine, but when I knocked on her door to check on her, she'd tell me to go away. The breaking point came one night after Emily had been caught shoplifting from the local convenience store. The store owner knew our parents, so instead of calling the police, he called Mom and Dad. When they got to the store, Emily didn't even try to deny it. She was so far gone by then, lost in whatever pain she was drowning in, that she just didn't care anymore. That's when our parents made the decision to send her to a rehab center in another town. Emily was furious. I had never seen her so angry. She smashed the vase in the living room, screamed at our parents that they didn't care about her, that they just wanted to get rid of her. She even turned on me, which hurt more than anything else. I'll never forget the look in her eyes when she shoved me to the floor that night, her face twisted with anger. "I hate you," she screamed, and it felt like she was tearing my heart apart. This wasn't my sister, the one who had been my protector, my friend, my everything. This was someone else, someone broken. Mom pulled me aside afterward and told me, "Maddie, it's not her. It's the drugs, the pain. She loves you, I promise." But it didn't feel like love. It felt like loss. When Emily left for the rehab center, there was no heartfelt goodbye. She stormed out of the house, not looking back. Our family was left standing in the living room, surrounded by shattered glass and broken hearts, wondering how we had ended up here. How had the girl who once held me close when I was scared become this stranger who barely even looked at me? Emily was gone, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. Emily's return from rehab was nothing like I had imagined. I remember the day she walked through the front door, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, looking like a different person physically. She had gained some weight back, her skin had a healthier glow, and her eyes were clearer, but that light that once made her Emily was gone. Mom and Dad had tried to prepare me for her return, telling me not to expect things to magically return to normal, that recovery was a process, and she was still going through it. But I was still hopeful, maybe naively so, that we could go back to how things used to be. As soon as she stepped into the house, I rushed over to greet her, my heart pounding with anticipation. I had missed her so much, missed the sister who had been my best friend, my protector. "Hey, Em," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but filled with the hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the start of something better. She glanced at me, her face expressionless, before she pushed past me like I wasn't even there. I stood there, frozen, watching her walk down the hallway toward her old bedroom, shutting the door behind her without a word. My breath caught in my throat as the familiar sting of rejection wrapped itself around my chest. I told myself she just needed time. After all, 2 months in rehab couldn't undo years of hurt and struggle, right? That evening, we all sat down for dinner. The tension in the air was thick, so thick you could almost taste it. Mom and Dad tried to make small talk, asking Emily how she was feeling, what the program had been like. But Emily barely responded, giving one-word answers, if she answered at all. I stayed quiet, not wanting to push her, but when I finally gathered the courage to ask her if she wanted to hang out later, maybe watch a movie or something like old times, she shot me a look so sharp I could almost feel it cut. "Why would I want to hang out with you?" she muttered under her breath, loud enough for everyone to hear but low enough that it could have been mistaken as a slip. But it wasn't a slip. It was deliberate. The weeks that followed were more of the same. Emily didn't just avoid me. She actively distanced herself from me, from all of us. She would lock herself in her room for hours, refusing to talk to anyone. And when she did come out, she was a different person. Gone was the Emily who used to patiently help me with my homework, the sister who stayed up late to make sure I wasn't scared of the dark. In her place was someone I barely recognized. Someone cold, distant, and, at times, cruel. Every attempt I made to reconnect was met with hostility. At first, I thought it was just frustration. Maybe she was still angry about being sent to rehab, about feeling abandoned. I tried to be understanding, tried to give her space while still showing her I cared. But the more I tried, the more she pushed me away. It wasn't just indifference, it was something darker. She wasn't just ignoring me, she was actively tearing me down. She started making comments, little jabs at first, things I could almost convince myself weren't meant to hurt. "You're so naive, Maddie," she'd say, laughing when I told her about something going on at school. Or, "Why would anyone want to hang out with you?" when I mentioned my friends. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just her way of coping, but it only got worse. At dinner, she would go out of her way to make me feel small. Do you even have friends, Maddie? Or do they all just feel sorry for you? She sneered one night, her fork clinking against her plate as she stabbed at her food. Mom and Dad tried to keep things light, brushing off her comments as just sibling bickering, but it wasn't that. This was different. It wasn't playful teasing. It was malicious, and it hurt. The breaking point came one Friday evening. We were all sitting around the table for our usual family dinner, and things had been tense as usual. Emily had been in one of her moods, quiet, brooding, and clearly itching for a fight. I was doing my best to stay out of her way, to avoid setting her off. I had developed a sort of sixth sense for when she was on the verge of snapping, and that night, it was like walking on a tightrope. One wrong move, and I knew she'd explode. But I didn't expect what happened next. Mom had made salad as a side dish, nothing fancy, just lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, and some chopped peanuts for a little crunch. Everyone knew about my peanut allergy. It wasn't severe enough to send me into anaphylactic shock, but it would cause my throat to swell, and I'd struggle to breathe. It was something I'd dealt with my whole life, and the family had always been careful. So when Emily brought over a separate bowl of salad, claiming she'd made it specially for me, I didn't think much of it. I was touched, honestly. It had been so long since she'd done anything remotely thoughtful. I smiled at her, my chest warming at the gesture. "Thanks, Em," I said softly, feeling like maybe, just maybe, this was a step in the right direction. She didn't respond, just gave me a tight-lipped smile as I took a bite of the salad. At first, everything seemed fine, but then it hit me. My throat started to tingle, and within seconds, it began to swell. Panic gripped me as I realized what was happening. I looked down at the salad and saw the unmistakable bits of peanut mixed in with the lettuce. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as I started choking, gasping for air. Mom and Dad leaped into action, rushing to get my medication, while Emily sat there, completely calm, watching me struggle as if it were no big deal. When Dad managed to get the epinephrine pin into my leg, I finally felt the swelling start to subside, but the terror remained. When I looked at Emily, my eyes wide with disbelief, she shrugged. "What?" she said, her voice flat. "You're always so dramatic. It's not like you were actually dying." That was it. That was the moment everything shattered. The trust one had in her, the hope that my sister was still in there somewhere. It was all gone. She had known. She had known about my allergy, and she had done it anyway. On purpose. I couldn't look at her the same way after that. Fear started to creep in whenever she was around. I avoided her as much as possible, spending more and more time locked in my room, finding excuses to stay out of the house. The person who had once been my protector was now someone I was terrified of. I didn't know what she was capable of anymore. Mom and Dad tried to downplay the incident, telling me that Emily was still struggling, that she didn't mean it. But I knew better. Emily wasn't the same person anymore, and I couldn't trust her. I couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to keep me safe because they didn't see what I saw. They still believed she could come back from this, that things could somehow go back to normal. But I knew the truth. The sister I had loved so much, the one who had been my everything, was gone. When my parents suggested Emily go to therapy, I thought it might be the one thing that could finally help her. After all, rehab had only seemed to address the surface-level problems. The drugs were out of her system, but the deep-seated anger and cruelty remained. Therapy, I hoped, could peel back the layers and maybe bring some sense of understanding and healing between us. But Emily had a way of twisting things, even in therapy. Every time my parents dragged her to a session, she played the part perfectly, acting like the misunderstood victim, the one who had been unfairly sent away, the one who had been hurt by her family. She was good at it too. She'd tell the therapist just enough truth to make her story believable, but she'd always leave out the darker parts, like the time she nearly killed me with peanuts. I don't know how she did it, but she somehow convinced the therapist that she wasn't as much of a threat as I knew her to be. I overheard her talking to one therapist, feigning regret over the peanut incident. "It was a misunderstanding," she said. "I didn't think she'd really have a reaction. I never meant to hurt her. But she had meant to hurt me. I knew it, and she knew it, but she had a way of manipulating people. making them see her as the troubled but ultimately well-meaning sister. The therapist started telling my parents that her behavior was improving, that she just needed more patience and understanding. Every session she attended only seemed to drive us further apart because no one really saw what she was doing. She wasn't getting better. She was just getting better at hiding it. Eventually, I stopped expecting any real change. Emily was who she was now, and I had to live with that. After the peanut incident, I couldn't bring myself to sit at the dinner table with her anymore. Every time I looked at her, I felt a mix of fear and betrayal. The food in front of me would sit untouched as I watched her carefully, half expecting her to try something again. I knew I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I was always on high alert, always waiting for her next move. The anxiety around food became unbearable. I'd spend hours thinking about whether or not it was safe to eat anything that had been in the house. I started avoiding family meals altogether. Mom noticed, of course. She was worried about me, but she didn't know what to do. She tried talking to Emily about it, but Emily would brush her off, saying things like, "Maddie's just being dramatic." Mom, though, understood my fear better than she let on. One day, she surprised me by buying a small refrigerator for my room. "I figured this might help," she said gently, "so you can keep your own food separate." It was such a relief. I stocked that mini fridge with whatever I could find that hadn't been touched by Emily, packets of snacks, pre-packaged salads, things I knew hadn't been tampered with. I ate alone most nights, sitting cross-legged on my bed with my little stash of safe food. It wasn't the healthiest lifestyle, but it was the only way I could feel safe in my own home. The day I left for college was one of the happiest days of my life. The moment I stepped onto the campus of Lakewood University, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if Emily was going to do something to hurt me. The distance between us was finally enough that I could breathe freely again. At Lakewood, I found a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in English literature, which had always been my passion. I joined clubs, made friends, and started building a life for myself that didn't revolve around the trauma I had endured at home. It was a new beginning. And then, in my sophomore year, I met Ethan. Ethan was in one of my classes, Introduction to Modern Literature. We bonded over our shared love of classic novels and our mutual disdain for group projects. At first, we were just friends, meeting up to study in the library or grab coffee between classes. He was easy to talk to, the kind of guy who actually listened when you spoke and had a way of making you feel heard. It was refreshing, especially after spending so many years feeling invisible in my own home. Our friendship slowly blossomed into something more. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, nothing like the dramatic, passionate love stories you see in the movies. Instead, it was steady, comforting. It felt like home in a way that nothing else had for a long time. We spent long nights talking about everything and nothing, our dreams, our fears, our pasts. When he proposed to me during our senior year, it felt right. It felt like I was finally closing the chapter on my old life and starting a new one with someone who truly cared about me. Ethan was my safe place, my future. But as perfect as things seemed at first, married life wasn't always easy. After we graduated, we moved to a small apartment in the city where Ethan started working as a software engineer, and I began teaching high school English. We both wanted kids, and we figured it would happen naturally, but after 2 years of trying with no success, we started to worry. Ethan became obsessed with finding a solution. He researched everything: fertility treatments, diets, lifestyle changes. He wanted to fix the problem, to make things right. But the more he fixated on it, the more it drove a wedge between us. I started to feel like I wasn't enough for him, like my inability to conceive was somehow making me less in his eyes. Every time I saw the look of disappointment on his face when yet another test came back negative, it chipped away at me a little more. We argued more frequently. I wanted to take a break from trying, to just live our lives for a while and let things happen naturally, but Ethan couldn't let it go. He became so focused on the idea of having children that it felt like he was slipping away from me. The warmth and kindness that had drawn me to him in the first place were being replaced by frustration and resentment. The first time Ethan cheated on me, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I found out through a mutual friend, who had seen him with another woman at a bar one night. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. Instead, he turned the blame on me. "If you could just give me a child, maybe I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere," he said, his words like daggers to my heart. It broke something in me, but I stayed. I told myself that it was a mistake, that we could work through it. I wanted to believe that the Ethan I had fallen in love with was still there, underneath the bitterness and the pain. But then he did it again, and this time, I couldn't ignore it. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. The final blow came not from Ethan's cheating, but from a betrayal I never saw coming. It had been months since the second affair, and our marriage was hanging by a thread. I was out with a few friends one night, trying to distract myself from the mess my life had become. We decided to stop by a bar near campus, a place Ethan and I used to go to back when we were still students. That's when I saw them, Ethan and Emily. They were sitting at the bar, huddled close, whispering to each other in a way that made my stomach turn. At first, I thought I must be imagining things. There was no way this could be real. But then I saw Emily lean in, her hand resting on Ethan's thigh as she whispered something in his ear. The look on his face, the way he smiled at her, was all too familiar. My blood turned to ice. I stood there, frozen, watching the two people I had once trusted more than anyone in the world betraying me in the worst possible way. It all made sense now. The distance, the coldness, the late nights Ethan had spent working. It wasn't just another woman this time. It was my sister. My mind raced with the memories of everything Emily had put me through. The years of torment, the manipulation, the fear. And now this. She had taken the one thing I had left, my marriage. I turned and left the bar, my heart pounding in my chest, the pain so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. In that moment, everything fell apart. The night I discovered Ethan and Emily together felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The image of them, sitting so casually in the bar, laughing and whispering like they hadn't just torn my world apart, haunted me for days. I didn't confront them right away. I couldn't. I needed time to process what had happened, to figure out how I was supposed to deal with such an enormous betrayal from the two people I had once loved the most. I didn't sleep that night, my mind replaying every moment of my relationship with Ethan, every moment of my childhood with Emily. How had it all come to this? I couldn't believe it at first, couldn't wrap my mind around the idea that they had been carrying on this affair behind my back for who knows how long. But as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. The truth was staring me in the face, and it was uglier than I had ever imagined. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove straight to my parents' house. When I walked through the front door, my mom took one look at my face and knew something was terribly wrong. She didn't ask any questions at first. She just wrapped her arms around me and let me cry. My dad stood nearby, his face full of concern, but he gave me space to speak when I was ready. I saw them. I finally whispered, my voice cracking. Ethan and Emily. They're together. My mom's grip on me tightened, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. My dad's face darkened, the anger in his eyes barely contained. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, though I could sense the fury building underneath. "They were at a bar," I said, wiping the tears from my cheeks. "I don't know where they are now, but they've been seeing each other behind my back." My dad didn't need to hear any more. He stormed out of the house, heading straight for Ethan and Emily's apartment. I wanted to stop him, to tell him it wasn't worth it, but I was too drained to do anything. My mom stayed with me, her hand rubbing my back as I sobbed into her shoulder. An hour later, my dad returned, his face flushed with rage. "I kicked them both out," he said firmly. "Told them they weren't welcome here anymore. Not in this house, not in this family." It should have brought me some relief, knowing that my parents were on my side, but all I felt was numbness. I had lost not only my husband, but also my sister in one fell swoop. The betrayal ran so deep that I didn't know if I could ever fully recover from it. I moved back in with my parents after that. I couldn't bear to stay in the apartment I had shared with Ethan, surrounded by memories of a life that had been a lie. Being at home felt like a regression, like I was back in high school, hiding from Emily and her cruelty. But this time, it wasn't just her I was hiding from. It was everything. My trust in people had been shattered, and I didn't know how to rebuild it. Ethan, predictably, tried to make excuses. He called and texted me constantly, begging for a chance to explain himself. When I finally agreed to meet him, more out of exhaustion than anything else, his explanation was even worse than I expected. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice trembling with what I could only hope was genuine regret. It just did. Emily and we were both in a bad place, and I cut him off. "You don't get to blame this on circumstances. You cheated on me with my sister." "I know, Maddie, I know. But we can work through this. We can go to therapy. We can." "No, Ethan. We can't," I said firmly. "I'm done." That was it. That was the moment I knew there was no going back. I had given Ethan so many chances after his first affair, and even after the second. But this? There was no fixing this. I told him I wanted a divorce, and for once, he didn't argue. He just nodded, defeated. The divorce process was long and painful, but it was necessary. My parents helped me through it, and eventually, I started to feel like I could breathe again. I no longer had to worry about Ethan or Emily, and that brought me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. As soon as the divorce was finalized, I used the alimony I received to get a place of my own, a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. It was a few weeks after the divorce was finalized that I found out I was pregnant. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of trying to conceive with Ethan, after all the heartache and frustration, I was finally pregnant. But the timing couldn't have been worse. I had just rid myself of Ethan, had just started to build a new life for myself, and now I was faced with the possibility of raising a child with a man who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I spent days in turmoil, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to keep the baby, to hold on to this one piece of my future that I had always dreamed of. But the circumstances were all wrong. I wasn't ready to be a mother, not like this. Not when my life was in shambles, not when the father of my child was someone I couldn't stand to look at. Ethan, of course, tried to use the pregnancy as a way to worm his way back into my life. He begged me to give him another chance, told me we could raise the baby together, that we could go to therapy and make things work. But I knew better. I knew that bringing a child into this mess would only make things worse, for me and for the baby. After weeks of agonizing over the decision, I made the difficult choice not to continue with the pregnancy. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but deep down, I knew it was the right one. I wasn't ready, and I didn't want to bring a child into a world full of pain and betrayal. The days after the procedure were some of the darkest I've ever known. The grief was overwhelming, even though I knew I had made the right choice. My parents were there for me, as they always had been, but it was still a lonely road to walk. As for Emily and Ethan, their relationship didn't last much longer after the divorce. I heard through the grapevine that they had moved in together after my dad kicked them out, but it wasn't long before things started to fall apart between them. Ethan had always been more interested in fixing things than in actually dealing with the consequences of his actions, and Emily, well, Emily was Emily. She had always been good at getting what she wanted, but once she had it, she didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't long before they were fighting constantly, and eventually, Ethan left her. I wasn't surprised. In the end, they were both broken people, and their relationship was built on lies and betrayal. It was never going to last. After Ethan left, Emily tried to come back to our parents, but they wouldn't let her. My dad had made it clear that she wasn't welcome in their home anymore, not after what she had done to me. She tried to argue, tried to convince them that she had changed, but they saw through her manipulation. She had burned too many bridges, and there was no going back. With nowhere else to go, Emily ended up bouncing from place to place. She crashed on friends' couches, stayed in cheap motels when she could afford it, and even lived in her car for a while. I heard from some old friends in Riverton that she had picked up odd jobs, working in diners and cleaning houses just to get by. She had always been good at surviving, but this was different. This was the consequence of years of pushing people away, of manipulating and hurting the ones who loved her most. I never saw her again. I didn't want to. In the end, I learned that healing isn't linear. It's not a straight path where everything gets better with time. Some days are still hard, and some wounds never fully heal. but I'm learning to live with the scars. I've built a new life for myself now, far away from Riverton and all the memories that haunted me there. I've made new friends, found a career that I'm passionate about, and most importantly, I've learned to trust again, starting with myself. Emily will always be a part of my story, but she no longer controls it. Neither does Ethan. Their betrayal no longer defines me. I define me. And that, I think, is the most important lesson of all. If you like the story, don't hesitate to subscribe and listen to new stories every day. Write in the comments what you like the most.